Our artillery, having nearly exhausted their ammunition in the protracted cannonade that preceded the advance of the infantry, were unable to reply or render the necessary support to the attacking party. Owing to this fact, which was unknown to me when the assault took place, the enemy was enabled to throw a strong force of infantry against our left, already wavering under a concentrated fire of artillery from the ridge in front and from Cemetery Hill on the left. It finally gave way, and the right, after penetrating the enemy's lines, entering his advanced works and capturing some of his artillery, was attacked simultaneously in front and on both flanks and driven back with heavy loss. Evidently, the reliance for the support of our left flank had been the fire of the 82 guns from Seminary Ridge. It was as over-sanguine as that expressed by Colin Long in the morning conference on the right, and it failed to note that the enemy might hold guns in reserve. This was done on the present occasion. Hunt, the Federal Chief of Artillery, had withdrawn many guns to await the charge which he knew was coming. The crumbling away of Pettigrew's left precipitated the advance of Wilcox. Pickett, who was riding with his staff in rear of his division, saw that the brigades on the left were breaking and sent 2 aides to endeavour to rally them, which they were unable to do. A third was sent at the same moment to Longstreet to say that the position in front would be taken, but that reinforcements would be required to hold it. Longstreet, in reply, directed Pickett to order up Wilcox, and Pickett sent 3 messengers in succession to be sure that the order was promptly acted upon. As the fugitives from Pettigrew's division came back, Wright's brigade of Anderson's division was moved forward a few hundred yards to cover their retreat. Later, after Wilcox had fallen back, by Lee's order, Wright was moved across to the rear in support of Wilcox, in case the enemy should make an advance, which at times seemed probable during the entire afternoon. It must be ever held a colossal mistake that Meade did not organize a counterstroke as soon as he discovered that the Confederate attack had been repulsed. He lost here an opportunity as great as McClellan lost at Sharpsburg. Our ammunition was so low, and our diminished forces were, at the moment, so widely dispersed along our unwisely extended line, that an advance by a single fresh corps, the 6th, for instance, could have cut us in 2. Meade might at least have felt that he had nothing to lose and everything to gain by making the effort. Longstreet felt that the lines held by Hood and McLaws were unwisely advanced for the changed conditions, and during the afternoon he quietly withdrew these divisions to the rear of the Emmitsburg road. During the process of the withdrawal, the enemy advanced McCandless's brigade of the 5th Corps into the neutral ground between the lines, where it accidentally encountered the 15th Gar of Benning's brigade. This, by mistake, had been marched to the front when it was intended to be moved to the rear. The regiment, though only numbering about 250, took a position and opened fire, expecting reinforcements. It was quickly outflanked, and only with difficulty, and by severe fighting, did it extricate itself, losing 101 men. During the morning there were cavalry affairs upon each of our flanks. Upon our left, Stuart advanced, and a severe combat ensued with Gregg's division and Custer's brigade. The result was a draw, each side claiming what it held at the close as a victory. Upon our right, Kilpatrick reports that at 8 a.m. he received orders to move to the left of the Federal line and attack the enemy's right and rear with his whole command, Custer's and Farnsworth's brigades, and the regular brigade, Merritt's. By some mistake, surely a fortunate one for the Confederates, Custer's brigade had already been sent to Gregg's division on the other flank. Our right was at first merely picketed by 100 cavalry on the extreme flank, while, nearer the position of our infantry, was a strong line of skirmishers with Bachman's and Riley's batteries in support. Had Kilpatrick come with 3 brigades upon our right flank, he could not have failed to discover an immense opportunity open to him. Behind the mask of our vedettes were wide fields stretching along the valleys of Willoughby Run and Marsh Creek for miles to the north and west, containing all our trains practically unguarded. The bulk of our cavalry was engaging Gregg's division about 2 miles east of Gettysburg. Once through our skirmish line, Kilpatrick would have had great scope before any adequate force could be brought against him. As it was, we had a narrow escape. Merritt's dismounted men had found the flank of our vedettes and were driving them rapidly to the rear when Anderson's brigade was brought to the rescue and Merritt was driven back. Meanwhile, Kilpatrick had ordered Farnsworth to charge through our long line of infantry pickets extending from the Emmitsburg Road to the right flank of our infantry line on the lower slope of Big Round Top. Farnsworth at first remonstrated, but then made the charge gallantly, with about 300 men of the 1st W. VAR and the 1st Vert. They rode through the Texan skirmish line, but found themselves surrounded with no escape but to make a circuit and return, broken into squads by the fire of infantry and artillery, and by the natural obstacles of the ground. Farnsworth fell with 5 mortal wounds. The total killed and wounded in the charge were 65. The report of the Federal Chief of Artillery gives interesting details. The supply of ammunition carried with that army was 270 rounds per gun. The Confederate Army carried for the campaign about 150 rounds per gun. Hunt reports an expenditure in action of 32,781 rounds, an average of 106 per gun for 310 guns, excluding the cavalry. Ewell's Corps reports 5851 rounds expended, and Hill's Corps 7112 rounds. No report was made of Longstreet's ammunition, but his 83 guns were all engaged, while Ewell and Hill each engaged only 65. Ewell averaged about 90 rounds per gun engaged, and Hill about 110. Longstreet's 83 guns doubtless averaged as much as Hill's, which would make about 9,000 for the battle. This gives an aggregate for the army of about 22,000 or 103 rounds per gun for 213 guns engaged, excluding cavalry. The killed and wounded, not including the missing, in the Federal Reserve Artillery, 108 guns all engaged, numbered 230, an average per gun of 2.1. In Longstreet's corps, the total was 271 for 83 guns, an average per gun of 2.6. In Ewell's, the total was 132, an average per gun engaged 2. In Hill's, the total was 128, and average per gun engaged 2. The destruction of artillery horses was very great, but figures are given only for Hill's corps. This reported 190 killed in action, 80 captured, 187 abandoned on the road, and 200 condemned as broken down, a total of 627 lost in the campaign, with 77 guns. Serving the 26 guns of Alexander's battalion, 138 men and 116 horses, or over 5 men and 4 horses per gun, were killed or wounded. The greater part of this loss was from artillery fire, and its severity shows that the ground occupied was unfavourable and afforded little shelter. An anxious inventory of the ammunition left on hand was made during that afternoon, and much relief was felt that enough for one day's fight was found. During the afternoon of the 3rd, Lee determined upon immediate retreat to Virginia. Such an end to our invasion had indeed been inevitable from its beginning, but the difficulties were now greatly increased. Fortunately, Meade was not in aggressive mood, and Lee decided to give his trains one day's start of his troops. Many Federal writers have sought to excuse Meade's failures to improve the opportunities offered him, one after the other, on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th and 11th, 12th, and 13th of July. It is needless to balance pros and cons. An axiom of the game of war is to attack whenever a large stake may be won by success, and but small loss incurred by repulse. Then the game is worth the candle, and the game must be played. It is the hardest of all games to a general new to the responsibility of chief command. Under cover of the night, Lee took a defensive line upon Seminary Ridge with its right flank retired to Willoughby Run. Here he stood all day of the 4th, apparently inviting attack, but fortunate in remaining unmolested. Imboden's cavalry had joined him on the 3rd, 2,100 strong, with a 6-gun battery. During the night of the 3rd, Imboden had been directed to organise most of our vehicles into a single train and to conduct it without a halt to Williamsport. Here it would stop only to feed, and would then ford the Potomac and move without a halt to Winchester. Imboden's force, with a few more guns, would guard the front and flanks of the column, which would be about 17 miles long. A brigade of Stuart's cavalry with a battery would guard the rear. Lee's medical director was charged to see that all the wounded who could bear the journey were carried in the empty wagons and ambulances. What this journey was to mean to the wounded, none seemed to have imagined before starting, or they would have greatly preferred to become prisoners. Every vehicle appeared to be loaded to its capacity. It was about 4 p.m. on the 4th before the head of the train was put in motion from Cashtown. Meanwhile, what would have seemed a visitation of the wrath of God had come upon us, had we not preferred the theory which has been previously referred to, that storms may be generated by heavy firings. Now there came suddenly, out of the clear sky of the day before, one of the heaviest rainfalls I have ever seen. Probably 4 inches of water fell within 12 hours, and it was sure to make the Potomac unfordable for a week. Imboden, in Battles and Leaders, gives the following description. Shortly after noon on the 4th, the very windows of heaven seemed to have opened. The rain fell in blinding sheets, the meadows were soon overflowed, and fences gave way before the raging streams. During the storm, wagons, ambulances, and artillery carriages by hundreds, nay by thousands, were assembling in the fields along the road from Gettysburg to Cashtown, in one confused and apparently inextricable mass. As the afternoon wore on, there was no abatement of the storm. Canvas was no protection against its fury, and the wounded men, lying upon the naked boards of the wagon bodies, were drenched. Horses and mules were blinded and maddened by the wind and water, and became almost unmanageable. My personal recollections of the occasion are vivid. About 5 p.m., my somewhat battered battalion drew into a meadow adjoining the Fairfield Pike, with orders to watch the passing column of troops and take its place in the column immediately behind the 3rd Corps when it passed. This might be, we were told, in an hour or two. There was good grass in the meadow and the horses needed food, but the need to move promptly when the time came prevented unhitching. By good fortune, 4 of us got possession of an old door upon which we could sit, laying it flat on a knoll some 50 yards from the road. On that door we sat or lay in the rain all night, every half hour taking turns in walking out to the road to see what command was passing. At daylight the rain ceased to fall, but the sky remained threatening. About 6 a.m. we took our place in the column and marched 19 hours until 1 a.m. that night. Then we bivouacked until 4 near Monterey Springs on the Blue Ridge. We then marched again for 14 hours and bivouacked about 6 p.m., 2 or 3 miles beyond Hagerstown. Ewell's corps, moving behind ours, did not leave the vicinity of Gettysburg until about noon on the 5th. The wagon train under Imboden moved on roads to our right, via Greenwood to Williamsport. It made better speed than our column of infantry and artillery, but at a cost of human suffering which it is terrible to contemplate. Some of the wounded were taken from the wagons dead at Williamsport, and many who were expected to recover died from the effects of the journey. Among these, it was said, were Gens. Pender and Semes, neither of whom had been thought mortally wounded. Imboden gives a harrowing account of the movement of the train, as follows. After dark, I set out from Cashtown to gain the head of the column during the night. My orders had been peremptory that there should be no halt for any cause whatever. If an accident should happen to any vehicle, it was immediately to be put out of the road and abandoned. The column moved rapidly, considering the rough roads and the darkness, and from almost every wagon issued heart-rending wails of agony. For 4 hours I hurried forward on my way to the front, and in all that time I was never out of hearing of the groans and cries of the wounded and dying. Scarcely 1 in 100 had received adequate surgical aid, owing to the demands on the hard-working surgeons from still worse cases which had to be left behind. Many of the wounded in the wagons had been without food for 36 hours. Their torn and bloody clothing, matted and hardened, was rasping the tender, inflamed, and still oozing wounds. Very few of the wagons had even a layer of straw in them, and all were without springs. The road was rough and rocky from the heavy washings of the preceding day. The jolting was enough to have killed strong men if long exposed to it. From nearly every wagon as the teams trotted on, urged by whip and shout, came such cries and shrieks as these. "Oh God, why can't I die? My God, will no one have mercy and kill me? Stop! Oh, for God's sake, stop just for 1 minute. Take me out and leave me to die by the roadside. I am dying! I am dying! My poor wife, my dear children, what will become of you?" No help could be rendered to any of the sufferers. No heed could be given to any of their appeals. Mercy and duty to the many forbade the loss of a moment in the vain effort then and there to comply with the prayers of the few. On, on, we must move on. The storm continued, and the darkness was appalling. There was no time to fill even a canteen of water for a dying man, for except the drivers and the guards, all were wounded and utterly helpless in that vast procession of misery. When daylight came, the head of the column had reached Greencastle, having traversed about 30 miles, and it still had 15 to go to reach Williamsport. Here began a succession of small attacks of the long train by citizens, and small detachments of Federal cavalry scouting in the country. At one point some citizens cut the spokes of a dozen wagons, but a guard sent back, arrested, and took them off as prisoners of war. At another point about 100 wagons were captured. The head of the column reached Williamsport in the afternoon, and during the night the balance came up. Here it met 2 regiments of Johnson's division, returning from Staunton, where they had escorted the prisoners taken at Winchester on the advance. Imboden required every family in the town to cook provisions for the wounded, under pain of having its kitchen occupied. The river was in flood and impassable, except by 2 small ferryboats. Next morning he learned of the approach of 5 Federal brigades of cavalry, about 7,000 men with 18 guns. The flanks of the city fortunately rested upon creeks, leaving only the north front to be defended. He armed about 800 teamsters and convalescents, and with the 2 regiments of infantry and his dismounted cavalry, he marched about so as to create the impression of a large force. He put in the line all of his guns and brought over some ammunition in the ferryboats. A sharp fight ensued, the teamsters acquitting themselves handsomely. The enemy was driven back and held off until the approach of Stuart's cavalry in the afternoon caused the Federal cavalry to withdraw. As a precaution against such freshets, Lee had maintained a pontoon bridge at Falling Waters. But it was weakly guarded, and on June 5th a small raiding party, sent by French from Frederick, had broken it and destroyed some of its boats, fortunately not all. The retreat of the army was therefore brought to a standstill just when 48 hours more would have placed it beyond pursuit. We were already nearly out of provisions, and now the army was about to be penned upon the river bank and subjected to an attack at his leisure by Meade. All diligence was used to relieve the situation. The ferryboats were in use by day and by night, carrying over, first, our wounded, and next 5,000 Federal prisoners brought from Gettysburg. These were safely escorted on to Staunton by Imboden with a single regiment of infantry. Warehouses upon the canal were torn down, and from the timber new pontoon boats were being built to repair the bridge at Falling Waters. Meanwhile, the engineers selected and fortified a line of battle upon which we would make a last stand. A fairly good line was found with its right flank on the Potomac near Downsville, passing by St. James College and resting its left on the Conococheague. Longstreet's corps held its right flank, Hill the centre, and Ewell the left. On the 10th, Meade was approaching rapidly, driving in our advanced guards. An unfortunate affair occurred at Funkstown, where Anderson's Gunch Brigade, called upon to assist our cavalry, was so badly directed by them that a Federal battery enfiladed the line, and a battery of our own horse artillery by mistake also fired into it. The brigade suffered 126 casualties. On the 11th, the army was ordered into position upon the selected line, Lee in person overlooking the placing of Longstreet's corps. I never before, and never afterward, saw him as I thought visibly anxious over an approaching action, but I did upon this occasion. No one can say what might have been the result of a Federal attack, for although our supply of ammunition was low, we were on the defensive, and the temper of the troops was excellent for a desperate resistance. Meade's report indicates easy acquiescence in our retreat from Gettysburg. While the 6th Corps followed us to the vicinity of Fairfield on the 5th, picking up stragglers, the rest of the army remained on the battlefield for 2 days, employed in succouring the wounded and burying the dead. A third day was lost. Halting a day at Middletown to procure necessary supplies and to bring up the trains. Under ordinary circumstances, Lee might now have been across the Potomac, but there were further rains on the 7th and 8th, and Lee's escape was exceedingly narrow. On the 13th, both his bridge and the ford near Williamsport were passable, and orders were issued to make the crossing during that night. The river had fallen to a stage barely permitting infantry to ford, but about dark it again began to rise. Ewell's corps was ordered to cross by the ford. Longstreet, followed by Hill, was to cross by the pontoon bridge. Caissons were ordered to start from the lines at 5 p.m., the infantry and artillery at dark. Meade might have attacked on the 12th, but contented himself with reconnaissance. As a result of the reconnaissance of the 12th, he assembled his corps commanders and proposed a demonstration in force on the 13th by the whole army, to be converted into an attack if any opening was found. The opinion of a majority of his leading officers was so adverse to the proposition that Meade allowed himself to be persuaded, thus giving Lee the last day needed. Later in the day, he repented and issued orders for a general advance on the 14th. It was made just a day too late. Lee had left only 2 guns stalled in the mud, and a few hundred stragglers broken down by the night march, short in distance, but rarely equalled for its discomfort and fatigue. Another rainstorm had set in before dusk, and it kept up nearly all night. It was the dark period of the moon, and the blackness of the night was phenomenal. The route to the bridge was over small farm roads, rough, narrow, and hilly. Already from the incessant rains, they were in bad condition, and now, under the long procession of heavy wheels churning in the mud, they became canals of slush in which many vehicles were hopelessly stalled. My command, between sunset and sunrise, was only able to cover about 3 miles, seldom moving more than a few yards at a time. Large bonfires on the banks were kept up to light the entrance upon the bridge, but in spite of them, a wagon loaded with wounded ran off into the river. After daylight, the weather cleared and better progress was made, with the last of Hill's corps crossing about 1 p.m. During the morning, it was followed by the enemy who skirmished with our rearguard and picked up stragglers. In one of these skirmishes, a small body of Federal cavalry was allowed to approach within 200 yards of Heth's division under Pettigrew, who supposed them to be our own cavalry bringing up the rear. These, however, had passed without giving notice that they were the last. A Major Weber of the 6th Mechant Cavalry, seeing but a small portion of the Confederate line, charged it with about 40 men. Weber was killed, and 9/10 of his command were shot down, but one of a few pistol shots which they fired gave a mortal wound to General Pettigrew. He had been wounded in the hand on the Three and was unable to manage his horse, which reared and fell with him. In the act of rising, the fatal shot struck him. Ewell's corps reached Williamsport by the Hagerstown Turnpike and commenced fording the river by midnight. The artillery with an escort of 1 brigade was sent to cross the pontoon bridge. Rhodes's report describes the fording of the Potomac as follows. My division waded the river just above the aqueduct over the mouth of the Conococheague. The operation was a perilous one. It was very dark, raining, and excessively muddy. The men had to wade through the aqueduct, down the steep bank of sow and slippery mud, in which numbers lost their shoes, and down in which many fell. The water was cold, deep, and rising. The lights on either side of the river were dim, just affording enough light to mark the places of entrance and exit. The cartridge boxes of the men had to be placed around their necks. Some small men had to be carried over by their comrades. The water was up to the armpits of a full-sized man. All the circumstances attending this crossing combined to make it an affair, not only involving great hardship, but one of great danger to the men and company officers. But be it said to the honour of these brave fellows, they encountered it not only promptly, but actually with cheers and laughter. We crossed without loss except of some 25,000 or 30,000 rounds of ammunition unavoidably wetted and spoiled. After crossing, I marched a short distance beyond Falling Waters and then bivouacked, and there ended the Pas campaign. It is not necessary to follow the march of the army from the Potomac via Front Royal and Culpeper to the line of the Rapidan, which it finally occupied. It is notable that Lee had not proposed to entirely withdraw from an aggressive attitude when he crossed the Potomac. His report states that he intended to cross the Blue Ridge into Loudoun Cove, where he might oppose Meade's crossing into Vee, but that the Shenandoah was found to be impassable. While waiting for it to subside, the enemy crossed below and seized the passes he had designed to use. Not only this, but Meade also moved along the eastern slope, threatening to cut Lee off from Gordonsville and the railroad. Longstreet was pushed ahead and barely succeeded in crossing the Shenandoah in time to prevent the enemy from occupying Manassas and Chester Gaps, through which Longstreet moved to Culpeper by July 24th. Hill's corps soon followed, and Ewell, moving farther up the valley, crossed at Thornton's Gap. All were finally united behind the Rapidan on Oganda 4, while the cavalry, under Stuart, held Culpeper, and the enemy held the line of the Rappahannock. The following tables of casualties furnish the best comparative indications of the amount of fighting which fell to the lot of different organizations. It is notable that 6 Confederate brigades were not severely engaged, and the 6th Federal Corps was scarcely engaged at all. The totals given are from the official returns of both armies, but the Confederate returns are known to be very incomplete. The best estimate of actual Confederate losses has been made by Livermore in numbers and losses in the Civil War. It is about 50% greater for the killed and wounded and is attached hereto. Chapter 19. Battle of Chickamauga. Having rested at Culpeper from July 24 to 31, and then crossed the Rapidan to Orange C.H., where we could receive supplies by rail, Lee's army now recuperated rapidly from its exhaustion by the campaign of Gettysburg. There remained nearly 5 months of open weather before winter. The prospects of the Confederacy had been sadly altered by our failures at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Grant would now be able to bring against us in Gay. Rosecrans reinforced by the army which had taken Vicksburg. To remain idle was to give the enemy time to do this. Once more, the necessity was upon us to devise some offensive which might bring on a battle with approximately equal chances. Lee, accordingly, urged forward the building up of his own army with the design of an early aggressive movement against Meade. It must be admitted that the opportunity for such was slight. The enemy's fortified lines about Alexandria were too near, as was proven later when in Novidere an advance was actually attempted. But the Confederacy still held unimpaired the advantage of the interior lines, already spoken of as open to them in May, and then urged by Longstreet both upon Secretary Seddon and Lee. These still offered the sole opportunity ever presented the South for a great strategic victory. Already, however, movements of the enemy were on foot, which, in a few weeks, would enable them to close the shorter route from Richmond to Chattanooga via Knoxville, and leave us only the much longer and less favorable line via Weldon, Wilmington, and Augusta. Unfortunately, no one but Longstreet seems to have appreciated this, and he was very slow in again taking up the matter and urging it. It resulted that the movement, when attempted, was too late to utilize the short Knoxville line, and that only 5 small brigades of infantry were transferred to the west, in time to take any part in the hard-fought Battle of Chickamauga. This was consequently but another bloody and fruitless victory, to be followed by a terrible defeat in a few weeks, when the enemy's reinforcements had joined. It is first to tell of the dilatory consideration and slow acceptance of the proposed strategy, which should have been decided upon even before Lee's army was again south of the Potomac, and every subsequent movement planned to facilitate it. It was not until about August 15, 2 weeks after the army was safe behind the Rapidan, that Longstreet again called the attention of Seki Sedon to the tremendous threatenings of the situation, and pointed out the one hope of escape which he could suggest. There seems to have been no reply. A few days later, in conversation with Lee, Longstreet again expressed his views. Lee was unwilling to consider going west in person, but approved the sending of Longstreet, and even spoke of his being given independent command there if the War Department could be brought to approve. About August 23, Lee was called to Richmond and was detained there by President Davis for nearly 2 weeks. During this time, consent was given that Longstreet should go to reinforce Bragg against Rosecrans, but with only Hood's and McLaws's divisions, 9 brigades, and my battalion of 26 guns. It was proposed to send this force from Louisa C.H. by rail to Chattanooga, via Bristol and Knoxville, a distance of but 540 miles, and it was hoped that the movement could be made within 4 days. There was too little appreciation of the importance of time in the enterprise proposed, and it was not until September 9 that the first train came to Louisa C.H. to begin the transportation. On that day, 2,000 Confederates under General Fraser, who had been unwisely held at Cumberland Gap and allowed to be surrounded by a superior force, surrendered without a fight. Already Burnside had occupied Knoxville, leaving us only the long line via Petersburg, Wilmington, Augusta, and Atlanta, about 925 miles, with imperfect connections through some cities and some changes of gauge. The infantry was given precedence, and my battalion was marched to Petersburg, where it took trains about 4 p.m. Thursday, September 17. At 2 a.m. Sunday, the 20th, we reached Wilmington, 225 miles in 58 hours. Here we changed cars and ferried the river, leaving at 2 p.m. The Battle of Chickamauga was being fought upon the 19th and 20th, only 5 of our 9 brigades having arrived in time to participate. We reached Kingsville, SC, 192 miles in 28 hours, changed trains in 6 hours, and got to Augusta, 140 miles, at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, the 22nd. Leaving Augusta at 7 p.m., we reached Atlanta, 171 miles, at 2 p.m., Wednesday. Leaving at 4 a.m., Thursday, we were carried 115 miles and landed at Ringgold Station, 12 miles from the battlefield, at 2 a.m., on Friday, September 25. Our journey by rail had been 843 miles and had consumed 7 days and 10 hours, or 178 hours. It could scarcely be considered rapid transit, yet under the circumstances it was really a very creditable feat for our railroad service under the attendant circumstances. We found ourselves restricted to the use of one long roundabout line of single-track road of light construction, much of it of the stringer track of those days, a 16-pound rail on stringers, with very moderate equipment and of different gauges, for the entire service at the time of a great battle of the principal armies of the Confederacy. The task would have taxed a double-tracked road with modern equipment. Its efficient performance was simply impossible, and the incomplete success we were able to obtain by getting 5 brigades of Longstreet's infantry upon the field, without any of his artillery, shows the soundness of our strategy, and is an earnest of what might have been accomplished, had a campaign upon our short interior lines been inaugurated in May, under Lee in person, instead of the unfortunate invasion of Parr. Indeed, it must be said of the battle itself that the force upon the field was ample to have reaped the full fruits of victory, had its management been judicious. The story of the details, presently to be told, is but another story of excellent fighting made vain by inefficient handling of an army hastily brought together, poorly organized and badly commanded. It will be seen that the battle was opened by 2 divisions attacking the whole army of the enemy in a fortified position, the attack being made in a single line without supports at hand. They are defeated and put out of action for the day. 2 more divisions try and fare little better. A 5th, in reserve, sends in 1 brigade without result. 4 are not engaged. The morning is gone, and the battle of the right wing is over. That of the left wing has scarcely begun. It advances, finds by accident a gap in the enemy's line, and drives off 3 divisions of the enemy. The left wing fights the rest of the enemy's army, 3/4 of it, until near dark, when both wings unite and drive the enemy off the field, darkness covering his retreat. It is the old familiar story of piecemeal attacks. On the arrival of Longstreet, Bragg's army would comprise 5 corps and a reserve division, organised as shown below. No exact returns of the total present for duty exist, but instead are given Livermore's estimates of the effective strength. Neither in armament, equipment, or organisation was the Western Army in even nearly as good shape as the Army of Northern Virginia. About 1/3 of the infantry was still armed only with the smooth-bore musket calibre 69. Only a few batteries of the artillery were formed into battalions, and their ammunition was all of inferior quality. Much has been said in the accounts of prior battles of the insufficient and unskilled staff service in the Army of Northern Virginia, even after many active campaigns. The Western armies generally had had far less opportunities to learn from experience, and fewer resigned ex-army officers from the old U.S. Army among them, to organise and train their raw material. Several of Bragg's divisions had been recently brought together and were strangers to each other. Nearly all were unfamiliar with the country in which they found themselves, which was unusually wooded and hilly. Bragg himself was lacking in quick appreciation of features of topography. The organisation of the Federal Army, with its strength present for duty before the battle, is given below, and also Livermore's estimate of the effective strength. Comparing the two armies, we see that while Bragg's effective total, 66,326, is largely greater than Rosecrans, 58,222, it is due to Bragg's excess in cavalry, 6182, which arm had little opportunity in the battle upon either side. Of infantry and artillery, Rosecrans had an excess of 1853 men and 30 guns, besides the superiority of his small arms and rifled artillery over the inferior equipment of the Confederates. It is well recognized that the defensive role is the least hazardous, and, on this campaign, Rosecrans, although on the strategic offensive, gladly seized the tactical defensive when Bragg incautiously gave him the privilege. Bragg's daily experience in the handling of his army should have warned him that it was not a military machine which could be relied upon to execute orders strictly, or to be alert to seize passing opportunities, and it is safe to say that its power for offence was scarcely 50% of what the same force would have developed upon the defensive. The position at Chattanooga held by Bragg at the beginning of the campaign was entirely untenable, as Rosecrans's line of approach along the Nashville and Chattanooga RR, reaching the Tennessee River at Stevenson, threatened Bragg's communications for 40 miles south, and he was forced to fall back without a battle and take position where he might guard his communications. He withdrew from Chattanooga on September 8 and moving south about 22. Miles disposed his forces in the vicinity of Lafayette and held the gaps in Pigeon Mountain, a spur of the great plateau of Lookout Mountain running northeast, with McLemore's Cove between the two. Rosecrans was misled by Bragg's easy abandonment of Chattanooga into the belief that his retreat would be continued at least as far as Dalton, and perhaps to Rome. So, with little delay or caution, the Federal troops were pushed forward in rapid pursuit. As the country was semi-mountainous, well-wooded, and but sparsely settled, neither commander proved able to keep himself fully informed of his adversary's movements. Each lost, therefore, possible opportunities of attacking isolated portions of his adversary with a superior force. The most important of these was lost by Bragg, who, on September 10 and 11, might have crushed in McLemore's Cove parts of Thomas's and McCook's corps. Orders were issued for attacks, but there was no supervision of the necessary preparatory movements, and various obstacles intervened until the enemy discovered his danger and made his escape. Bragg, in his official report, placed the principal blame for this failure upon General Hindman and preferred charges against him, which, upon further investigation, he subsequently withdrew. There can be no doubt that upon this occasion an opportunity was lost to the Confederates, which might have won the campaign. But the loss was due entirely to the misfortune of inadequate organisation and lack of the trained staff, which alone can make an efficient army of any assemblage of troops. Of course, rumours of the sending of Longstreet with 2 divisions to reinforce Bragg were sure to, and did, reach the enemy by many channels and from many sources. Even from the lines along the Rapidan, there were deserters and Negro servants who were well informed about all considerable movements. At Richmond and Petersburg, at Wilmington, Charleston, and Atlanta, the enemy doubtless maintained spies, and the coming of the reinforcements from Lee was no secret among Bragg's brigades, even long before their arrival. One would suppose, too, that the wisdom of such strategy would be so apparent that it would be easily guessed, on hearing that any movement was on foot. It is therefore worthy of note that the Federal War Department, where reports and rumours from all sources were brought together and studied, even as late as September 11, was inclined to believe that Bragg was reinforcing Lee. It was not convinced to the contrary until September 15. Before that, Rosecrans had discovered the proximity of Bragg's army and had hastened to concentrate his scattered divisions, some of which, mistaking the roads, made marches of 50 miles. The concentration took place in the valley of Chickamauga Creek, about 12 miles south of Chattanooga on the western slope of Missionary Ridge. Bragg, meanwhile, realizing something of his opportunities, made more than one effort to strike in detail some of the nearest Federal divisions, but was unable to succeed. It was only on the night of the 17th that he finally issued an order for an advance in force upon the next day. Having waited so long, he had best have waited longer. Already he had given Rosecrans just the time needed to concentrate his entire army. Even a day sooner might have caught portions of it out of position and much exposed, but when the action opened on the 19th, not only was the whole Federal army in hand, but most of it had fairly well entrenched itself. There was now no reason to hasten an attack, and there were 2 reasons for delay. First, by taking a threatening position and using his superior force of cavalry upon Rosecrans's rear, he might have forced the Federals to attack, and Bragg's army, as has been said, was twice as powerful for defence as for offence. Second, he was now receiving reinforcements, averaging nearly a brigade a day. On the 19th, only Hood with 3 of Longstreet's veteran brigades had reached the field. Longstreet, in person with 2 more, arrived in time to take part on the 20th. McLaws, with 4 more brigades of infantry and 26 guns of the reserve artillery, were close behind, and were enough to have turned the evenly balanced scale in the battle. On September 15, Rosecrans's army was west of the Chickamauga, and had its right extended south beyond the line of Bragg's army. Bragg's right, at the same time, east of the Chickamauga, extended north beyond Rosecrans's line. Either army, changing front to its left, might thus have turned the other's flank with great advantage, but neither was quite prepared to act promptly. Rosecrans, however, on the 17th, appreciated his own danger and began to extend his left and to draw down his right, practically moving his whole army to the left. This movement was continued during the night of the 18th and on the morning of the 19th. Before Bragg was prepared to open his attack, Rosecrans's left had occupied the strong ground chosen for it to rest upon, on Kelly's Farm, about 9 miles south of Chattanooga. From this point, the line extended to the Chickamauga at Lee and Gordon's Mill, about 4 miles, with the divisions in the following order from left to right: Brannan, Baird, Reynolds, Palmer, Van Cleve, Wood, with Negley's division in reserve, and the 3 divisions of McCook's corps, Davis, Johnson, and Sheridan, massed near Crawfish Spring, nearby on the right. At Rossville, 6 miles from Chattanooga and about 3 north of Kelly's Farm, was Granger's Reserve Corps of 3 brigades, holding the very important gap at that point in Missionary Ridge. Bragg's order of battle was of the progressive or echelon type, and prescribed that the attack should be begun by his right column under Hood, which should cross at Reed's Bridge, and, turning to the left oblique, should sweep up the Chickamauga and be reinforced as it proceeded by Walker's and Buckner's corps, crossing by Alexander's Bridge and Tedford's Ford. Meanwhile, Polk, at Lee and Gordon's Mill, should press the enemy, bearing to the right where resistance was met until a crossing was made at or between the mill and Dalton's or Tedford's Ford. Hill's corps would watch the left flank and cross and attack the enemy's right if he attempted to reinforce his centre. The cavalry would protect the flanks, Wheeler on the left and Forrest on the right. Cooking was ordered to be done at the trains, and cooked rations forwarded to the troops. This order seems simple, well conceived, and apparently as well adapted to surrounding conditions as it could have been made, but its execution, as will be seen, departed widely from the course prescribed. The right column under Hood, charged with the opening of the battle, was composed of 3 brigades of Hood's and 3 of Bushrod Johnson's. In reaching their assigned positions, there was much delay to all of the columns due to the bad and narrow roads through the forest, and in addition, Hood's column was opposed by the enemy's cavalry and had a preliminary skirmish at Peavine Church. At Reed's Bridge, and also at Alexander's, it was necessary to force the crossing, and both bridges were so injured by the enemy that fords somewhere in the vicinity had to be used to cross the stream. These delays consumed the whole of the 18th, and, at nightfall, Hood's 6 brigades and Walker's 5 bivouacked on the west side of the Chickamauga about 1.5 miles in front of the Rossville and Lafayette Road, upon which Rosecrans began to arrive and take position before daylight on the 19th. Buckner's corps at Tedford's Ford, having been directed to delay until Hood and Walker were across, had, after a slight skirmish, gotten possession of both banks of the river at Tedford's and also at Dalton's, a half-mile to the left. Polk's corps and Hill's occupied the day in moving from the vicinity of Lafayette to their prescribed positions opposite the enemy's right. At dawn on the 19th, the division of Buckner began crossing at Tedford's and Dalton's, but before they were ready to attack, the initiative was seized by the Federals, under the impression that only a single Confederate brigade was in front of them. Croxton's brigade, supported by the other 2 brigades of Brannan's division, was ordered to advance. This brought on the battle, which was waged all day with severe losses on each side, but with material success on neither. The entire Federal army was engaged, except 2 brigades. Of the Confederates, the brigades of Anderson, Diaz, Manigault, Helm, Adams, Stovall, Gracie, Trigg, Kelly, Kershaw, and Humphreys were not engaged. The fighting was desultory and without concert of action. From 7 a.m. until noon, there was a gap of about 2 miles between the 14th and 21st Federal Corps, which, had the Confederates discovered it, might have given them the victory. The fighting was kept up until dark. Longstreet arrived on the field at 11 p.m., having arrived at Catoosa Station about 4 and ridden without a guide, narrowly missing riding into the enemy. The battle was ordered to be renewed at daylight, but under a different organization. The army was now divided into 2 wings, the right under Polk and the left under Longstreet. To Polk's wing was assigned Cheatham's division of his corps, and the corps of Hill and Walker, with the cavalry under Forrest on the right. To Longstreet, Bragg gave the division of Hindman of Polk's corps, Johnson's division, Buckner's corps, and the 5 brigades of Hood's and McLaws's divisions, with the cavalry under Wheeler on the left. This organization was adopted because the troops were already approximately in the positions assigned, but it involved further subdivision of the command without any increase of staff, and led to an unfortunate delay of some hours in opening the battle. This was to be begun by Hill's corps at daylight. Sunrise was at 5:45. The orders were given by Bragg to Polk about midnight, but never reached Hill until 7:30 in the morning. The locations of the different commanders were not known to each other. When the orders to attack arrived, there were essential preparations still to be made, as the troops were not in position, and 2 hours were consumed in getting them even approximately so. These hours were very precious to the enemy. All during the night, the noise of his axes had been heard felling trees and building breastworks of logs, and this work was kept up until the Federal right, under Thomas, occupied a veritable citadel, from which assaults by infantry alone could scarcely dislodge him. His divisions were in the following order from left to right: Baird of the 14th Corps, Johnson of the 20th, Palmer of the 21st, Reynolds of the 14th. These divisions occupied the breastworks above described, which ran north and south, and were terminated at each end by wings extending well to the rear. Next on the right was Brannan's division of the 14th, and then Negley's of the same. Then came Sheridan and Davis of the 20th, and then Wood and Van Cleve of the 21st in reserve. At 9:30 a.m., Breckinridge moved to the attack and was soon followed by Cleburne. These two divisions were unfortunately placed in a single line and without any supports in the rear. They advanced in the following order from right to left: Adams, Stovall, Helm, Polk, Wood, Deschler. The two right brigades of Adams and Stovall were found to entirely overlap the enemy's line, and they pushed on slowly and gradually swung to the left and came into collision with the retired portion of the enemy's line. Meanwhile, the centre of Helm's brigade had struck the enemy's fortified line, and after a severe fight in which Helm was killed, it was repulsed. The brigades of Adams and Stovall were now entirely isolated, but maintained their aggressive until Adams was himself wounded and captured, when they were withdrawn, and the three brigades cut no further figure in the battle until late in the afternoon. Had Cleburne's division been behind this division in support, or even had their advance been simultaneous, there might have been a different story to tell. Its three brigades, Polk, Wood, and Deschler, were also in single line and advanced a little after the repulse of Helm. Polk and the right flank of Wood's met the same fire which had repulsed Helm. Wood and Deschler advanced farther before they received it, but they were all driven back with heavy losses, which included Deschler himself. The contest was kept up for a long time and was reinforced by the 5 brigades of Walker's division, who were brought up from the rear and put in at various points without making any serious impression. These brigades constituted the whole command of Polk in charge of the left wing, except the division of Cheatham, which contained 5 brigades. Why neither Bragg or Polk put them in until after 6 p.m. is not explained. One would imagine that they would have been called upon before giving up the whole plan of the battle, which was now done. Originally, it had been designed to break the left flank of the enemy and then sweep him to the right. Now the effort will be to break the right flank and sweep to the left. And in this, the right wing of the army will take no more part than the left wing has taken in the Battle of the Morning, and Cheatham's division will practically take none at all. About 11 a.m., Bragg, finding the attack on the enemy's left making no progress, sent a staff officer down the lines with orders to every division commander to move upon the enemy immediately. The order was first delivered to Stuart's division of Buckner's corps. This formed 2 lines deep and 2 brigades front, with the aid of Wood's brigade of Cleburne's division on its right. The 4 brigades, Brown and Wood, followed by Clayton and Bate, advanced together. The enemy were driven by this charge some 200 yards and lost a battery of guns, but here the impulse was gone and the advance stopped. Meanwhile, Longstreet had appealed to Bragg for permission to attack with his entire wing and, consent being given, had formed Johnson's division with Fulton and McNair in front, with Gregg in the second line and with Hood's division in a third line. Hindman's division formed on the left, and about 11:30 a general advance was essayed. Preston's division was in reserve on the extreme left. It is now time to look in the Federal ranks and see what was taking place there. Although the attack was only made at 9:30 and by only 12 brigades and was resisted by Thomas with 12 brigades in fortified lines, yet at 10:10 a.m. we find Garfield, Rosecrans's adjutant, writing to McCook to be prepared to support the left flank. At all hazards, even if the right is drawn wholly to the present left. At 10:30 he called for help, and Sheridan's division was ordered to him. At 10:45, upon a further call, Van Cleve's division was also ordered to support him with all dispatch. Negley's division had withdrawn from its position in line to support Baird, and had been replaced by Wood's division, making the order of the divisions: Baird, Johnson, Palmer, Reynolds, Brannan, Wood, Davis, Sheridan. About this time another message from Thomas reached Rosecrans that he was heavily pressed, and the aide who brought it informed Rosecrans that Brannan was out of line and Reynolds's right was exposed. On this, Rosecrans dictated a message to Wood. The general commanding directs that you close up on Reynolds as fast as possible and support him." This order changed the issue of the battle. Reynolds's division was slightly echeloned with Brannan's, but no one other than Reynolds considered it worthy of note. When Wood obeyed his order and reached the ground, Brannan was found to already occupy it, and Thomas sent Wood on to the support of Baird. Reynolds had blundered in his complaint, and Rosecrans had blundered in acting on it without reference to Thomas. On receipt of the order, Wood, leaving his skirmishers in front, started his division at a double quick to the left, passing in rear of Brannan's division to reach the right of Reynolds. He had advanced but little more than a brigade length when Johnson's Confederate division, supported by Hood and Hindman, burst through the forest in front and fell upon the movement. Had this movement of Wood's division been foreseen by the Confederates and prepared for, it could not have happened more opportunely for them. Longstreet has been given great credit for it, which, however, he never claimed. It was entirely accidental and unforeseen, but in a very brief period it threw the entire left flank of the enemy in a panic. Longstreet's advance cut off the rear of Buell's brigade of Wood's division, and 2 brigades of Sheridan's advancing to fill the gap being opened behind Wood. These brigades did not make enough resistance to check the Confederates, whose triple lines could be seen advancing and who now followed the fugitives. Hindman's brigades, diverging to the left, routed the division of Davis and captured 27 guns and over 1,000 prisoners. Rosecrans, McCook, and Crittenden were all caught and involved in the confusion of a retreat which soon became a panic. It was not, however, pursued, and might have halted and been reformed within a mile of the field without seeing the enemy. The retreat, however, was continued to Chattanooga. A severe check was sustained by Manigault, who attacked Wilder's brigade. This brigade had 2 regiments armed with Spencer repeating rifles, and the 29th Ilian serving with it on this occasion carried the same arm. They occupied a very favourable position on a steep ridge, and their fire at close quarters was very severe and drove back the first advance. Then, finding themselves isolated, they presently withdrew from the field. About this time, Longstreet was sent for by Bragg, who was some distance in rear of Longstreet's present position. The change in the order of battle was explained to Bragg and the route of 2 divisions of the enemy, and he was requested to draw the forces from the right wing to unite with the left and move behind Thomas, where a gap of great extent had been opened, and drive him out of his fortified position. Bragg, however, was discouraged and said there was no fight left in the right wing. Cheatham's division had not been engaged. Longstreet's account of the interview states, "He, Bragg, did not wait, nor did he express approval or disapproval of the operations of the left wing, but rode for his headquarters at Reed's Bridge. There was nothing for the left wing to do but to work along as best it could." A pause in the fighting now ensued, which the Federals employed in forming a new line for their centre and right with the troops remaining on the field, Baird, Johnson, Palmer, and Reynolds, whose positions had not been changed, and Brannan with fragments of Wood, Negley, and Van Cleve. With these troops, a short and very strong line was formed scarcely a mile in extent from right to left, and occupying favourable ground in the forest, which gave it protection from artillery fire. In plan, the right wing of this line covered 2 re-entrant angles located on commanding ridges, from which they were able to deliver a plunging fire by volley, the ranks alternating with little exposure. During the afternoon, they were reinforced by 2 brigades of Granger's division coming up from Rossville. Practically about 2/3 of the army, say 30,000 men under Thomas, here held together in a strong position and stood practically back to back, while he repelled a series of desperate charges by the brigades of Anderson, Dease and Manigault, Gracie, Trigg and Kelly, Gregg, McNair and Fulton, and the 5 brigades of Longstreet, Kershaw, Humphreys, Law, Robertson and Benning, about 25,000. Not more than half of these brigades were engaged at any one time. The bayonet was sometimes used, and men were killed with clubbed muskets. This was kept up from 2 to 6 p.m., during which time the infantry fire was incessant and tremendous. About 5 p.m., Longstreet succeeded in getting 11 guns under Williams into position, whence their fire could take in flank and rear the positions of Thomas's 4 left divisions, but the distance was about 900 yards, and the effect was not immediate. About 6 p.m., the Confederates on the right flank, who had lain quiet since noon, recovering from their severe punishment in the morning, prepared to make a general advance. About the same time, Thomas had taken warning from the artillery fire now coming in on his flank and rear and made preparations to withdraw his command. He had also received orders from Rosecrans to withdraw to Rossville, but had delayed to execute them until the last moment. It had now come, and had he delayed longer, his losses would have been great. As it was, they were comparatively light. At some points there were severe struggles, and at others there was little resistance. But everywhere his lines were occupied, and the triumphant Confederates celebrated their victory with such cheering as is said never to have been heard before. The table of casualties shows the heaviest percentages of the war. Deducting the missing, many of whom were prisoners, and also the losses of the cavalry, which were light, the killed and wounded among the infantry and artillery were 14,871 out of 47,520, or over 31% among the Confederates. Among the Federal infantry and artillery, the killed and wounded were 11,243 out of 55,799, or an average of about 21%. No returns are given of the Confederate losses in the cavalry, but they were very light in the Federal cavalry, only 32 killed and 136 wounded, and there is no reason to suppose them any heavier among the Confederates. Apparently the forest paralyzed the cavalry of both armies. Very many of the reports of the Confederate brigadiers state the number of men engaged, and these statements, excluding cooking details, ambulance men and stragglers, are more exact than the official returns, and are used in estimating the percentages of killed and wounded. In Gist's and Hood's divisions, only no figures are given, and here estimates have been made in round numbers. There is much discrepancy in the reports of the two commanders as to the guns, small arms, and prisoners taken. Bragg reports 51 guns and 15,000 stand of small arms. Rosecrans admits but 36 guns and 8,450 small arms, which is more probably correct. The Confederates were in the habit of exchanging their inferior guns and small arms on the field for the better ones of the enemy, leaving the old in their places. Some of these found on the field were by mistake assumed to be captured. A list of the 51 reported captured is given in the reports with the manufacturer's marks, and of these 15 appear as of Confederate make. Of prisoners, Bragg reports 8,000, while Rosecrans admits but 4750. No accurate returns were made of the prisoners captured. The numbers were largely guesswork, the same prisoners being often claimed by more than one command. There is no reason to doubt the accuracy of Rosecrans's report. It gives also some interesting statistics of the ammunition expended, which was but 73.25 rounds of artillery and 2,650,000 of infantry. The wooded character of the field is shown in the comparatively small amount of artillery ammunition, which is said to have been 12,625 less than was expended at Stone River, and is less than 1/4 of the Federal expenditure at Gettysburg. On the morning of the 21st, the army under Thomas was in position on Missionary Ridge, about Rossville, 5 miles in rear of the field of the day before. Here it took position and awaited attack all day, but none was made. Longstreet reports that he advised crossing the Tennessee River and moving upon Rosecrans's communications, and that Bragg approved and ordered Polk's wing to take the lead, while his wing cared for the wounded and policed the field. The army, however, was in such confusion and need of ammunition that it was dark before the rear of Polk's corps was stretched out upon the road, and Longstreet's march was postponed until the 22nd. During the night, Thomas withdrew into the city, which was already partially fortified, and was now easily made impregnable. Bragg followed on the 22nd and took position in front of him. Longstreet's scheme of moving across the Tennessee River on Rosecrans's communications he deemed impracticable and dropped it. The town was not invested closely, but position was taken on Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, about 3 miles out, with the intention of compelling the evacuation of Chattanooga by cutting it off from its base of supplies at Stevenson, Ayla. The shortest and best road came via Jasper, crossed the river at Kelly's Ferry, and recrossing at Brown's Ferry found itself directly opposite Chattanooga on the north side of the river, about 40 miles from Stevenson. But this road could not be used. Below Kelly's Ferry it skirted the river and was commanded by small arms from the south side. This compelled the enemy to cross Walden's Ridge to get by, adding many miles to their journey over exceedingly rough country. The importance of holding strongly the country between the two ferries, Kelly's and Brown's, seems never to have been appreciated by either Bragg or Longstreet, who had charge of the left wing of the army. The duty was confided to a single small brigade, Law's, of Hood's division, which was sent around the toe of Lookout Mountain for the purpose. A full division at least should have guarded so important a point, and one so exposed. The opportunity to blockade the wagon traffic was not at once understood by the Confederates, and it was OCT, 11 before it was fully enforced. After that date, wagons were often 8 days in bringing a load from Stevenson, and reduced rations were issued to the Federals. Wheeler's cavalry in a raid had destroyed most of the transportation of the 14th Corps, but was itself nearly destroyed by the opportunity of plundering the wagons. Couriers reported that, from Bridgeport to the foot of the mountains, the mud is up to the horses' bellies. On the 6th, Rosecrans reported, "The possession of the river is a sine qua non to the holding of Chattanooga." Reconnaissances and preparations were made, and on the night of the 27th, a flotilla of pontoons, carrying about 1,500 men under Hazen, was floated down and landed at Brown's Ferry. On the north side, a force was marched by land to meet them, and a pontoon bridge was built. By morning, a brigade with artillery was established and fortifying itself in a strong position on the southern bank. Before Bragg could concentrate enough to attack them, Hooker appeared, coming from Bridgeport, with the 11th and 12th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. These had been hurried out to reinforce Rosecrans when the Federals realized that Longstreet had reinforced Bragg. This, of course, put an end to the contemplated attack, but with very questionable judgment, Bragg ordered a night attack upon a portion of Geary's division of the 12th Corps, about 1,500 strong with 4 guns, which had encamped at a point called Wauhatchie. This was about 3 miles from Brown's Ferry, where Hooker, with the remainder of his force, had united with the force under Hazen.